So who knows what that is?
Logos.
Yeah, you guys even kind of pronounced it right, probably logos. Um, it's a Greek for the word, right? But I was actually told by somebody when is teaching me Greek or trying to that the word doesn't actually mean word. The word is it like it would in English, but it actually expresses more like the thought that's behind the word in the Greek. And so depending on the context, it can mean the intent, the purpose, the plan, and it could be, of course, the word in written form or spoken form, or it could actually be still in the mind and not yet spoken or not yet written or not yet manifest in some other way. And we can be pretty sure by the Greek lexicons and so forth, but that the word means sort of like purpose or intent. And of course, that's the way it is found also. I won't look it up, but in Acts 10:29, it's in the King James reads, I ask therefore for what intent you have sent me. In other words, for what purpose or what the word there is logos. And it's hard to try to twist that meaning there into anything else other than intent, or what was some versions will render this for what purpose or what reason, and sometimes it's just like why have you sent me. So the logos is sort of like, you can think of it as the reason why. So so progressing to this slide here, here's where we find it in probably its most notoriously famously quoted passage. And I've broken it up into three parts as what's kind of done very commonly. So now you'd suppose that a logos in the past tense here, in this where it says was, sort of, would be sort of a reason or intent. But unfortunately, when it comes to John 1, it's translated in the English as word still. And it's even decorated with capital W there, as if just to assume that it's a title. And of course, the word here is translated from the Greek logos. So I would prefer if it said intent or the reason or something of that nature, but it is translated word. Now, everybody's pretty familiar with this verse. A lot of Christians who haven't even read the Bible have probably been exposed to this verse. For some reason, a lot of Christian Bible classes, they instead of starting somewhere in Genesis or Matthew, they start in John 1. And in fact, when I first went to Cal Poly, my college, and I thought, I got to see if there's any Christian groups on campus here to talk about the Bible with. And there was a Christian group, and they wanted to have a Bible class, and they wanted to start in John 1. And of course, he gave you the very Trinitarian viewpoint of that. So they teach, of course, that Jesus is God, because, and this has been going on for hundreds of years, of course. The Trinitarian friends of ours, they look at this verse, and then they look at verse 14, where the word becomes Jesus, and they say, see, therefore, Jesus is God, case closed. And it seems like open and shut case, but we're going to open that case back up today. I hope to accomplish that in this presentation, to sort of reverse that verdict or that judgment. So as you can see, I broke it up into three parts, and the presentation today is actually going to start with part C. And you might ask why I want to start with part C, because the reason is it's, for me, easier to unpack it and start with the easy stuff first and work your way back. And I don't think part C for us would be very controversial how it should be interpreted, but I hope to get through part C today, And there's a subsequent presentation I'll give, I think, in a few weeks, that where I'll back up and I'll handle parts A and B. So 2 courses, we get to handle one whole verse, just about the same pace as our Wednesday night Bible class. Half of verse per session here. Also, I like to start with part C because I just, to tell the truth, I started studying this one because I was always kind of puzzled by this phrase, the word was God. And I kind of knew what it didn't mean, but I wasn't 100% sure I could explain what it meant. Before I get started here, let me just make a quick confession that, when I was young and stupid, okay, not that long ago maybe, but I used to hop onto this evangelical forum, carm.org, and they have this forums.carm.org where they have all these different doctrinal discussions, and there was, of course, a forum in there about the Trinity. And I used to go in there and think, oh, I'm gonna go there and I'm gonna talk some sense into these poor folks, that haven't had the same sort of Bible reading basis for their understanding that I have. A lot of them have been to some sort of seminar and they teach them what they're supposed to think. And here I was, what did I know? I was just raised, in a Christadelphian home where we learned how to read from the Bible, right? So it was sort of, as far as I knew, I knew that, Jesus wasn't God, because Jesus was Jesus and God is God. It was never a confusing subject for me, but I thought, I'll just get in there and I'll just help some of these people with their understanding and show them some. I'm sure they'll listen to logic and reason. And I found most of the time, though, after about 10 years of hoping that people would listen, that it was actually kind of naive of me to think that, because I didn't realize it at the time. But a lot of the people that are in there that you're talking to, they have a bias. A lot of them are paid pastors and paid preachers, and in some situations they've written books and so forth, and they have a significant bias confirmation going on. In other words, they're locked into their beliefs, and changing their belief would cost them something, and either they'd be ostracized, or they'd be suffer shame, or have to recant what they've written in their books, or in the case of preachers, they would maybe have to go get an actual real job instead of preaching to what people want to hear, or so forth. So in other words, so I sort of got the message eventually, that Mark, you're casting on the wrong side of the boat here. So, but it wasn't a complete loss, because I mean, all that it was constantly going back and forth between Bible verses, and it really reinforced my understanding of a lot of the scriptures. And I came away with a much deeper understanding of the atonement, or at least how the world viewed the atonement, and versus scripture, how it is unscriptural, which I wasn't aware of. And I knew that Christadelphians didn't believe in a substitutional atonement, for example, but I didn't always understand, what do we believe? What's the alternative to that? So those years of shuffling through Bible verses and understanding Christology and so forth, it helped in some ways. It was beneficial, I think. Yeah, it wasn't a complete waste of time, at least. Look at back and think, wish it wasn't a waste of time. So at one point, while I was still trolling the Trinitarians, I came across this really interesting article by Nick the Catholic, saying, of all the possible strange things, that Jesus is not God. And so there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance when you hear a Catholic saying that Jesus is not God, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't believe Jesus is God. But what he's saying is that the way to interpret John 1 verse 1, that John 1 verse 1 is not saying that And what I found kind of interesting, of course, this is what you call hostile witness testimony, which basically means somebody is testifying to something that it might actually undermine their own position. And I think it demonstrates intellectual honesty, and I think that it's very potent form of evidence when you see hostile witness testimony going on. And whenever you see this, you kind of stop and you take notice, and you investigate a little bit deeper. And so if you were to go through this blog page, and if you were to actually go there and read it, you'll find that what he's discussing is John 1:1 part C, where it says in plain English that the word was God. And he's saying that it doesn't actually say that. And I think he's right that it doesn't actually mean that, but I'm not exactly sure the JWs have it 100% right either. But he's saying that the JWs are correct, but they have their own sort of twist to this passage. But because they believe, of course, that Jesus pre-existed as Michael the Archangel, and a lot of other kind of strange ideas. But let's focus on actually, I think, what John 1:1 does mean. And I have to say, like I said, being raised in Christadelphian home, I learned to read from the Bible around age 5. Every day after dinner was Bible reading time, right? So all 3 portions, we sit down, and it was about 40 minutes to read and discuss and ask questions. So I knew that Jesus wasn't God. So what's going on with this verse? And so and in these forums, I'd tune into this CARM forum probably a couple times a week, and review every discussion that was posted. And we could talk about why it doesn't make sense that Jesus would be it only makes sense that Jesus would be a human being. We can't have a superhuman priest. That wouldn't make any sense. And there's a lot to where Jesus grew and in wisdom and stature and so forth. These things wouldn't make sense for some sort of pre-existing God man that came here and pretended to be a human being. So I knew that Jesus was a human being. I didn't have any problem with that. But these people would come in with these big arguments about so-and-so grammar expert and Greek grammar expert, and they're using all these intellectual arguments, and they're throwing around all these words about this passage and how the Greek should be read. And this, I thought, this is probably what they were going through in Jesus's day. We know the experts of the law and all their kind of intimidating arguments. And anyways, I would hear all these grammar terms and people quoting these experts, and I just had no clue whatsoever what they were talking about. And so so basically, I would just sort of tiptoe around these kinds of discussions and move on to the next one. This guy here, though, you might look at him and think, hey, he doesn't look very bright, but actually you'd be wrong about that. So Munger was Warren Buffett's business partner since 1978. He studied human psychology, and he used that knowledge, of course, to excel in investing. He did quite well for himself over the years, and I know that we're not we're not interested in getting rich, but we should be interested in these words that he's saying, because basically what he's saying here, I never allow myself to have an opinion on anything that I don't know the other side's argument better than they do. Well, what he's saying is basically it amounts to making sure that you're not wrong about something before you get vested interest in it. And it just seems wise before you lock into something. You examine the evidence from both sides. What are the strongest arguments and evidence from both sides? And in my case, you know, I had to buckle down. I've had times when somebody asked me my viewpoint before, and I wasn't really convinced I knew the subject. And when I found myself unable to explain something, it really bothers me because I'm thinking, well, maybe I don't understand it, you know, and if I can't explain it, how can I say that I understand it? So basically, I just wanted to be able to explain what is the right understanding for this verse. So yeah, I had to go back and I had to look at all these arguments in these forums that went by. I had to look up definitions. I had to weigh the evidence, and I'm not a Greek expert, and I'm certainly not a grammar expert, but I'm certainly able to read everyone else's arguments and compare and check their evidence in reference books and educate myself a little bit along the way. Um, so yeah, I had to. This is how I felt, right, when I was reading these arguments, and this is sort of my Goliath, right? I gotta, how am I gonna start? Where do I start? You know, and how do I get going here? So so yeah, this uh I went back and kind of tried to understand things a little better. And this is the result of that. I threw this subverse up there and parsed it out a little bit there, and you can kind of see the parts that I've identified and from some of these terms that are thrown around. And of course, there's the conjunction and then the predicate, which has the object and the verb in it. Is that combination that they call the predicate. And the definite article the is in front of the logos, the or the word or the reason, the intent. Um, and the verb here, in is a was, and it's classified as a copular verb or a joining verb. It's joining as in it's saying something was something else or something seemed like something else, or it's basically, instead of saying um, the subject is acting upon the object, you're saying the subject is described by the object somehow. And so that's where the copular verb. And so all these elements come together in here, plus more. They indicate that the subject's being described by the object rather than acting upon it. So anyways, until you look at the differences in between the Greek and the English, I mean, this all seems kind of straightforward. In English, we always put the subject before the verb followed by the object. So so the predicate is always after the subject. So unless you're Yoda, you would say something like Frank caught the ball. You know, Frank is the subject and caught the ball is the predicate. And so we have, I was told in Greek, I don't know, but that it could go either way. The subject and you know, the noun and the subject, and the noun, that's the object. One could come before the other, but that it's the word suffix itself that differentiates or helps determine which noun, excuse me, is the object and which noun is the subject. But in the Greek, they use word order for emphasis rather than to designate the object and the subject. Anyways, so there's another way to know that, I guess, according to Greek experts that I've read. They say that in this case, the logos is the subject because it has the definite article, the. Another point of focus here, and also according to Greek experts, there are a few notable things. about this predicate structure that are clues to parsing how to translate it. First, the predicate object theos or God is pre-verbal. Pre-verbal means it comes before the verb there. And so, and also of note, I guess, is the theos there is anarthrous, which means it doesn't have an article. It has no definite article the and no indefinite article and in fact, Greek doesn't even use indefinite articles. Of course, the big question here comes down to this here. How is theos meant to be taken? Is it meant to be taken definite as God himself, indefinite as, would be worded as a God, or qualitative God, like it's very God, or godlike? And there's been several different phrases for rendering that, which we'll get into later. But now that we have kind of some of this understanding under our belt, we'd be in a better position now to kind of go back and review some of the Christological, theological arguments where it comes to this verse and see what everyone's talking about. So when it comes to this verse, you hear people throwing around the names of experts, and these two are usually mentioned in this verse context, what I've found. And for decades, I guess, people were kind of bamboozled by this theologian Caldwell, specifically the way he worded this tendency that he discovered. So what he's saying is predicate nouns which precede the verb usually lack the article. In other words, what he's saying is that theos here could be, therefore, definite. So this this is something that, when I heard, I was completely intimidated by it. And I'm not a Greek expert, and I'm not a grammar expert, and I'm certainly not a statistics expert. And but I guess even before Caldwell, according to Mark Twain, this was a quote by Benjamin Disraeli. There are three kinds of lies: damned lies, and statistics. So there's a lot you can do with statistics to fool people, in other words. So in other words, lies that use statistics are the most insidious because they're not possible to disprove. And in fact, the statement that he gives here is absolutely correct, but it's the context in which he presents this this fact that is perhaps twisted and deceptive. So Wallace here comes along, and he's actually citing work from a prior statistical analysis done by Paul Dixon in 1975. But Wallace, this was his book, I think it's called Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. He says that the rule, Caldwell's rule, says nothing about the definiteness when the anarthrous predicate nominative precedes the verb. It is qualitative in 50 of 53 occurrences. The statistical probability of theos being qualitative rather than either definitive or indefinite, definite or indefinite, is quite high, 94%. So in other words, chances are extremely good that theos in this verb is to be taken qualitatively. In other words, saying that a word might be like godlike. And again, we'll suggest some other possible renderings, but very low chances of it being rendered a God or God himself. That was not the intended meaning. Yeah. So what Wallace is saying, yeah, is that theos here is qualitative, and Daniel Wallace is an extremely high caliber Greek scholar. So quoting Wallace usually puts an end to the argument, pretty much, is what I found. So and people don't usually bother to argue against Wallace. So yeah, the cool thing about this though is Wallace, again, he's a Trinitarian, and he could have just gone along with Caldwell and say, hey, Logos is God, what do you want? But um, if you want to know actually the honest truth, why he was honest, it looks like to me. So Trinitarian scholars like Wallace, Harris, and Robertson, they have to admit here that theos in John 1:1c is qualitative, because a definite theos here would identify the Word as the Father, because of what we find in 1:1b, where it says the Word was with God. And if you identify the Word as the Father, now you have modalism, not Trinitarianism. And Trinitarians view modalism as a heresy. So they will not allow that interpretation. In fact, the more educated ones, they're actually honest about how that should be rendered, and will use the proper statistics to give that rendering. So yeah. So anyways, I don't know. Maybe Wallace is intellectually honest, and maybe that, but it's more about a technicality. I don't know, but yeah. So just want to point out that there's probably some old timers who have been through this material before, have gone through everything and understood all the arguments, and they're probably thinking, I've already studied all this, and Mark's just wasting 45 minutes of my valuable time. But even for you, there's something fairly new. This is some new evidence, I guess, that came in, that actually from a very old document, manuscript, that it shows that during this very, very early period in time, that it was pretty much understood that this passage would be rendered with theos being not definitive, but as qualitatively rendered. So we're talking about from somewhere between the 2nd and the 4th century of dating for this manuscript that was found, where it was rendered in the Coptic as in a qualitative sense. So this is I don't know, 2011, fairly recent study that was put out in this Journal of Theological Studies. But just to show that there's some early manuscript evidence and textual criticism type of evidence here, that theos in this passage was understood in the qualitative sense, and from very early times, probably the pre-Nicene era. But luckily, so we still have these records of how the Greek was originally properly translated. So I've kind of thought, well, if it's qualitative, how do people that understand it that way translate it, and like how should it be translated? So I kind of went out and found some examples of how people would translate this, and let me just say, the majority of translations just say the Word was God, and they leave it at that, and they leave it to the reader to just like automatically know that God there is not a noun, but it's an adjective. And they just leave it that way. And if you go to, for example, look up BibleGateway.com, where you can see, you can compare like around 20 English translations or something, and you look at them all, they all say the word was God, and there's no variation to that almost at all. Um, the overwhelming majority of translations just say the word was God. So, but if you look around hard enough, you can find other renderings. Unfortunately, there's really not a great way to say this in English, I think, that makes a translation that no matter how you translate it, to translate the word God instead of a noun but make it an adjective, no matter what you do, it kind of sounds awkward. It comes out, there's not really a way to say it in English very well. But here's a few suggestions, and you can take your pick, or you can try to reword it. And there's again are rare, these kinds of translations, or they're people trying to be honest, I think. But it's rare. Yeah, and I think the implication is that I think there's some implications to this that we can get into later, but that the attributes of God is what this is really referring to when it says qualitative. It's not talking about God himself. It's talking about something having his attributes. And you might even think of it as his image. And there's several different other things that are implied there that, again, we can get into sort of in the next class or whatever. But then when we get into the first part of this verse, it's a good time to touch on some of that. But hopefully they'll kind of make this passage fit into John. And actually this verse, I think once we kind of get a grip on this verse, it really helps interpret the rest of John. But anyways, here's some of the renderings. The word was fully God. The word was divine. It was deistic or godly. This is let's see, the word was the same as God. And this one here is a very popular one among some of the more educated scholars. What God was, the word was. Basically, it's just trying to say they share the same attributes, the word and God. The word was Godish, something that Anthony Buzzard said he preferred. The word was fully expressive of God, his translation, I guess, his own. And God in essence and nature. Okay, so there's variations there. So this is kind of interesting. So Wallace's quote, again, this is a different quote from Wallace, but it's on the same passage. And here he's explaining how that he can keep his Trinitarian view and avoid modalism, where at the bottom he points out that the lack of the article tells us that Jesus Christ is not the Father. So as we kind of explained before, when you're comparing John 1:1b and 1:1c, and you're asking yourself, what is God there? And it has to be the same thing. It can't just change. So he's basically saying if we properly interpret God in 1:1c as not definitive God, but as qualitative or by character, then we can keep our Trinitarian viewpoint intact and not have to submit to modalism, which would be a heresy after all. So anyways, he also accepts here that theos is qualitative, but what he's doing is he's forcing, he uses the word essence, quality, and one other place I think he says something about nature. The Trinitarians a lot of times use the word essence, and you don't know exactly what they're talking about. But I think that what he's doing sometimes is he's forcing that quality, that qualitative sense, he's forcing that to be the essence or the nature as per the homoousia aspect of the Trinity doctrine, which teaches that Jesus is the same, or the God the Son is the same substance as the Father, or the same nature, or the same essence. But the verse doesn't specifically say what that quality is. It just says, it doesn't say it's referring to God's physical qualities or substance or nature. Wallace just makes that part up and inserts his 2 cents there. So, and I want to show you what happens to this quote. I did an exercise. I substituted all of his sort of presupposed Trinitarian word substitutions, and I crossed those out and I plugged back in biblical phrases. And here's what happens when you do that. When you take words like Jesus Christ and you just say the word, for example, and you just plug back in what the original wording was, you have like this. So what you find here when you remove all of the Trinitarian jargon, and force it back to biblical terms, what you find out is he's actually telling us what we already believe and know, the truth. So we translated accordingly, and the word was God. But then he says, its emphatic position stresses its essence or quality. Its lack of a definite article keeps us from identifying the word with God. That is to say, the word order tells us that the word has all the divine attributes that God has. Lack of the article tells us that the word is not God. So it's kind of interesting, he starts out saying that we translate it properly, the word was God, but then he ends up with he knows that the word was not God. But I think that it's interesting to say that we would agree with his conclusion here if we force back the biblical language on what he interpreted as and his Trinitarian sort of word substitutions. Yeah, and we don't know what his intentions were. He could just be actually, I'm not saying like that Wallace is trying to deceive people intentionally, but that he, it's awful easy to even fool ourselves sometimes, and that he might have actually got to that point where he's convinced himself. So yeah, I'll just leave off by saying a little bit of humor here. Jesus is God, but only in a certain kind of way, where you take God as an adjective, and you say that not as the noun. In other words, Jesus is not God Most High Himself as the noun God, Theos, but that Theos taken as an adjective here. And I think it makes sense too from now in verse 14, where it says, the word was made flesh, and then immediately it says, and we beheld his glory as the glory as of the only begotten of the Father. Now that makes perfect sense now how that's placed, because if we look at Theos as a qualitative sense, and the word becomes flesh, and it still has the attributes of the Father, full of grace and truth and full of God's glory. So Jesus was filled with grace and truth, or the glory of the Father, his character, not his physical nature necessarily. And I think we're almost done here. We're out of time. Any questions?
Now, Mark, what about just the whole context of John chapter 1?
Yeah. I'm down again to teach in 3 weeks. So I plan to finish off this verse parts A, B and A and look at what some folks have suggested for the context of John's logos. And that's a brief survey of what I have spent a lot of time studying, but I don't want to spend a lot of time hashing through it all. And also how the theme here fits in very well with John's theme throughout the whole gospel. And if I get far enough, of course, the beautiful message that's in this verse, once you get past the sort of the theological jargon and understanding of it, and you try to ask, what is God really trying to say here? The message is really beautiful, actually. So anyway, that's it. I just wanted to share that, share my study there.
Hi. I like your little say, what I tweak them with is I say, gee, sure, Jesus is God now, he just didn't used to be.
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
That gets them all bent out of shape.
They don't like to admit that there was a time when Jesus was not.
Yeah. That essence thing you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've gone. There was this Neoplatonic philosopher named Plotinus.
Yeah.
And you get this wonderful way of arranging the universe. There's something underneath what you can see.
Yeah.
Which is called the ousia, which is the essence of everything.
Yeah.
And that arranges itself or is acted into what you can see in three ways. One is which are called homostasis. One is a creative impulse. One is the thing that makes souls and such, or whatever. And the other thing is something that sustains things. That's why you needed three parts for a Trinity. When these guys, and Athanasius, by the way, who's the big Trinitarian, he quotes Plotinus more than he does the Bible in his arguments.
Sure. Yeah. And I'm sure Plotinus is building on the Philo, and Philo's building on Heraclitus and the Stoics, and their understanding of the Logos was that it was sort of the rational purpose of the universe. And what's interesting there is you got these Greek philosophers, and they understand that whatever created the universe and the world around us and has a reason or an intent or a purpose. In other words, it wasn't just like an accident that everything, just like the wind was blowing a certain direction one day and there's trees and stuff. They understand that not just that there's an intelligent force or being that created everything, but that there's a reason behind it all. Like there's some sort of a plan going on, that they would understand that from, just from their thinking, sitting down and thinking about things and looking around them, not necessarily understanding, ever looking at the Bible. But
yeah. And if you read the Nicene Creed really carefully, you end up with 4 gods, not 3.
Yeah, I don't. The Nicene Creed is. Luckily, that's not our statement of faith.
Well, it is for these guys, which is why they read it back into the Bible. But
yeah,
there's 4 gods in there. You got an indivisible Godhead, and then you got the other 3 parts. So you got 4 actually.
Yeah, there's no way. There's no way to understand it. It's just confusion.
So this wonderful class.
Thanks.
For those of us that like that stuff, really good.
I think we're out of time for Sunday school. I thought it went till 10:25 or something.
That is correct.
All right.